Hey everybody, let's jump into lesson 25 by quickly reviewing what we learned in lesson 24. In lesson 24, we looked at possible advantages of various traits, whether those traits were physiological, so internal structures, whether they were morphological, or if they were behavioral traits. And we started to make some connections if some of these structural traits, these physiological or physical traits, are connected possibly to some of the behaviors as well. We also compared which of those traits were genetic and which were environmental. And now that we're kind of understanding the way that these things happen, we are going to ask the question is, could this have happened before? What we see happening at the University of California, San Diego ecosystem, could this have happened in other populations where birds end up in a new environment where their adaptations are tested in their new environment? So, in order to answer this question, we need to know what other juncos can be found in North America. So, we're going to look at 12 different types of juncos. I'm not going to call them species yet. That's going to be up for you to determine. We're going to look at 12 different juncos. Now, these 12 different juncos have some different appearances. So, what you were responsible for doing in this was to look at these different juncos and were to look at what are some of the different variations that exist in their physical characteristics. Now, we saw quite a few variations. We saw variations in their head color. We saw variation in the lightness or darkness of the color of the feathers on their head. We saw difference in coloration of their bellies. We saw back color variation, wing color variation, even differences in the shape and length of their beak. And of course, if you also differences in the color of their eye. And of course, there were lots of other physical characteristic differences that we were able to find, but those were just a few of the big ones that stood out to us. Now, we watched a little section of a video and we looked at the environment in which all of these juncos live. And we were looking for similarities and differences about the environments that they tend to breed. What we saw from the video is that they tend to breed in wooded, forested areas, where, of course, they're going to have protection from predators and also access to food and water resources. So, forested, wooded areas, and most commonly also in higher elevation or mountainous types of areas. One thing that is different about the environments where they tend to breed is the location on the map of where they breed. And we were able to see that they breed anywhere from northern Canada and Alaska all the way down into southern Mexico. So we have some questions to ask. So we had some questions to ask about this. So the map shows some breeding ranges of just 6 populations. Of course, there's a lot more. And our juncos are not on this map. And we wanted to know that if you wanted to look for evidence of whether the juncos from these different populations ever interbred with one another, what parts of the map would you look for to observe such behavior? And then we marked the location on the map with small stars. Well, in order to have different types of juncos breeding with each other, that has to happen where the juncos are existing in the same place at the same time. And so we're going to look at the boundaries of their territories. So now that we have these areas of boundaries of territories, and we have this question is whether or not these different birds that look different are able to breed with one another, which is really important in determining whether or not two types or two different looking organisms are the same species or not. Well, we have to do some investigating. So let's look at the question that we could ask. Based on the data we analyzed in this lesson, which would be the graph, do you think that all these junco populations also separated and differentiated from a common ancestor population like the campus and mountain juncos did? Well, there's some pretty good evidence for that based on their morphological features. We know that there are 3 morphological differences between the campus birds and the Mount Laguna birds, and those are 3 big differences just in 60 years. Remember, those differences are how black the heads are, the length of the wing, and tail whiteness. Given that there's so many different morphological differences in these different juncos, provide some good evidence that that may be possible. But what additional evidence would we need to investigate our claim? Just because two organisms look similar or look different doesn't necessarily mean that they are or are not the same species. Humans look very different from one another, but we're all the same species. If you go to the animal shelter, you're going to see lots of dogs that look very different to each other. Big ones, small ones, Great Danes, Chihuahuas, Poodles, but they're all the same species. So looks alone don't help us determine if something's a different species. We need some additional evidence. Well, we're going to look small for our evidence. Just like we might look to see who's related to who on the Maury show, well, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to be looking for some DNA evidence. We're going to need to collect some DNA or some genetic evidence to determine whether or not they're the same species or not. The video claims that they are all considered the same species because they can interbreed where their territories overlap, and they have offspring that have the characteristics of both. So, based on that criteria for what makes 2 individual members of the same species, and what we know so far, could a male from a mountain population, or the mountain population, and a female from the campus population, should they be considered birds of the same species? What additional evidence would we need to investigate our claim? Well, in order to claim them the same species, they have to be able to breed with one another, and their offspring also have to be able to reproduce as well. So we would need to get evidence as to whether or not breeding is happening between the populations of birds, between the campus males and the Mount Laguna females, or vice versa, the Mount Laguna males and the campus females. So that's what we're heading into next. We're going to look at karyotype models and looking at patterns of inheritance for juncos. We're going to analyze some DNA samples for various juncos, be able to determine whether or not or how closely juncos are related to one another, and whether or not, based on genetic information, they're able to interbreed with one another. That was really quick, and that was lesson 25.